Our pup is freezing, Daddy.
The night a ruthless alpha and his child saved a homeless omega and discovered their fated mate. The moment Alpha Lysander touched the mysterious omega, he knew three things. She was his fated mate, she was running from powerful enemies, and protecting her would start a war that could destroy his kingdom. Can the most feared alpha in the realm choose love over politics when his mate's past threatens to burn down everything he's built? Chapter 1. The Iron Throne. The morning air in Chateau Frostveil carried the scent of impending snow as Alpha Lysander de Frostveil ascended the steps to his throne, each footfall echoing through the vast stone hall like a declaration of absolute authority. Nobles and courtiers lined the walls, their faces carefully arranged in expressions of respectful attention, though he could sense the undercurrent of fear that always accompanied his presence. At 34, Lysander had ruled the Northern Territories for 12 years, transforming a collection of fractious wolf packs into the most powerful domain in the realm. His methods were effective, if brutal, justice swift, mercy rare, and emotional consideration non-existent when matters of state demanded decisive action. "Bring forth the prisoner," he commanded, his voice carrying the natural dominance that made even the strongest wolves instinctively lower their eyes. Guards dragged forward a man whose once proud bearing had been broken by weeks in the castle dungeons. Etienne de Montclair, formerly a trusted vassal, now stood accused of selling intelligence to enemy packs, treason punishable by death under the ancient laws that governed their society. "Etienne de Montclair," Lysander began, steel-gray eyes fixed on the trembling figure before him. "You stand accused of betraying pack secrets to our enemies, endangering the lives of innocent families through your greed and duplicity. How do you answer these charges?" "My lord," Etienne's voice cracked like autumn leaves, "I have a wife, 3 small children who depend upon my protection. Surely mercy might be considered for one who has served faithfully for so many years before this single moment of weakness." The plea hung in the air like incense, heavy with desperation and hope that had no place in Lysander's calculations. Around the hall, nobles watched carefully, understanding that the Alpha's response would set precedent for future cases of disloyalty. "Your family's circumstances," Lysander replied with the cold precision that had earned him both respect and terror throughout the northern lands, should have motivated greater loyalty rather than providing an excuse for betrayal. Those who compromise pack security forfeit the right to consideration based on personal obligations. He rose from the ornate throne that had belonged to his ancestors for 3 centuries, each movement deliberate and final. "Etienne de Montclair, for the crime of treason against your pack and Alpha, I sentence you to death by beheading at tomorrow's dawn. Your family's lands and titles are forfeit to the crown, though I grant them safe passage to distant relatives who might provide shelter." Gasps echoed through the chamber as guards seized the condemned man, whose desperate pleas for reconsideration fell upon ears that had learned to ignore such appeals. Lysander had discovered early in his reign that emotional decisions led to weakness. Weakness invited challenge, and challenges threatened the stability upon which thousands of lives depended. "Court is dismissed," he declared, settling back into his throne as nobles began filing out with hurried conversations about the harsh sentence and its implications for their own conduct. Lord Commander Bastian approached the dais once the hall had emptied, his weathered face bearing the expression of someone who had served multiple Alphas and understood the burdens of leadership. "The sentence sends a clear message, my lord," he observed diplomatically, "though some may question whether mercy might have achieved similar results while preserving a family from destitution." "Mercy," Lysander replied without emotion, "is a luxury that leaders cannot afford when the security of the many depends upon the fear of the few. Better one family suffers than thousands face the consequences of unchecked treachery." Yet, as he spoke those words, something deep within his chest stirred uncomfortably. A whisper of doubt that he immediately suppressed through years of practiced discipline. Chapter 2. The Only Light. The heavy oak doors of the royal nursery opened with the soft whisper that marked Lysander's transition from feared alpha to devoted father, the only role that allowed him glimpses of the man he might have been under different circumstances. Here, surrounded by painted murals depicting fairy tales and gentle creatures, he could set aside the crown's crushing weight for precious stolen moments. "Papa!" 6-year-old Celeste launched herself into his arms with the fearless enthusiasm that only children possessed, her golden curls catching afternoon sunlight that streamed through diamond-paned windows. She wore a dress of sky-blue silk that made her violet eyes sparkle with mischief and intelligence that sometimes unnerved visiting nobles. "Ma petite étoile," he murmured against her hair, using the endearment that belonged only to these private moments between father and daughter. "How has your day been spent? Have your tutors reported satisfactory progress with your lessons?" "Maître Philippe says my arithmetic improves daily, though my handwriting requires continued attention." She settled comfortably against his chest, small fingers tracing the intricate embroidery on his doublet. "But Papa, why do you always look so sad when you think I'm not watching?" The question struck him like a physical blow, revealing how even a child could perceive the emptiness that had become his constant companion. He had believed himself skilled at maintaining facades, yet apparently his daughter possessed insight that penetrated defenses he thought impenetrable. "Sometimes the responsibilities of leadership create burdens that are difficult to carry gracefully," he answered carefully, unwilling to burden her young mind with the true weight of ruling through fear and isolation. "But spending time with you always lightens those burdens considerably." Celeste studied his face with the serious expression she wore when considering important matters. "Maman always said that sadness shared becomes smaller, while happiness shared grows larger. Perhaps if you shared your sadness with someone who loves you, it might hurt less." Her mother, Isabel, had died giving birth to Celeste, taking with her the last softness in Lysander's world, and leaving behind only duty, responsibility, and the fierce protectiveness he felt for this remarkable child. The pain of that loss had taught him that loving someone meant risking devastation that could compromise his ability to protect his people. "Your maman was very wise," he said finally. "Though some burdens must be carried alone to prevent them from hurting others who don't deserve such pain. But you're strong enough to carry anything, Papa. You're the strongest alpha in all the lands, everyone says so." Her absolute faith in his capabilities both warmed and worried him, since he understood how easily strength could become rigidity, protection could become isolation. Through the nursery windows, snow began falling with the lazy persistence that promised a harsh winter ahead. The sight reminded him of responsibilities that awaited his attention: reports from border patrols, assessments of grain stores, preparations for the season's challenges that could threaten his people's survival. "I must return to my duties soon," he said reluctantly, knowing that these moments with Celeste were the only times when his heart felt truly alive. "But perhaps this evening we might share supper together, just the two of us." "Could we have honey cakes?" she asked hopefully. "And could you tell me the story about the brave knight who rescued the lost princess from the tower where she'd been trapped by her own fears?" "Of course, ma chérie." He kissed her forehead gently, storing up her laughter and warmth against the cold calculations that would dominate the remainder of his day. "Never forget that you are loved beyond measure, even when duty requires me to seem distant or stern with others." As he prepared to leave, Celeste caught his hand with surprising strength. "Papa, promise me something?" "What would you have me promise?" "Promise that if someone needs help, really truly needs help, you'll try to save them even if it's difficult or dangerous. Mama always said that's what makes someone truly strong, protecting those who can't protect themselves." The innocent request carried weight that she couldn't possibly understand, touching the part of his soul he had buried beneath years of pragmatic leadership and emotional armor. "I promise, little star. Though sometimes the right choice isn't always the easy choice." Chapter 3. The Storm's Promise. The wind howled beyond the thick stone walls of Chateau Frostveil with a ferocity that spoke of nature's raw power unleashed upon the borderlands, while Lysander stood before the great hearth in his private study, reviewing reports that painted an increasingly dire picture of conditions throughout his territory. The storm had been building for 3 days, and now it raged with intensity that threatened anyone caught unprepared in its path. "The patrol reports are troubling, my lord," Captain Gaston announced as he entered with snow still clinging to his cloak and urgency written across his weathered features. 3 separate groups of travelers were spotted moving through the eastern passes before the storm reached full strength, but none have reached scheduled waypoints. Lysander set aside the parchment he'd been studying, grain inventory reports that showed stores adequate for his people, but thin enough to discourage unnecessary expenditure of resources on rescue operations that might prove futile. Logic dictated that anyone foolish enough to travel during such conditions had accepted responsibility for their own fate. "The eastern passes become impassable during storms of this magnitude," he replied, moving to the window where ice crystals formed intricate patterns on glass, thick enough to withstand siege weapons. Search parties would face the same conditions that trapped these travelers, risking additional lives for uncertain outcomes. "Yes, my lord. Though the scouts did mention—" Captain Gaston hesitated, clearly wrestling with information he was reluctant to share. One of the groups appeared to include women and children, moving slowly as if burdened by illness or injury. The additional detail struck Lysander like a physical blow, awakening protective instincts that he'd spent years learning to suppress when they conflicted with practical necessities. Women and children meant innocents who bore no responsibility for the circumstances that had placed them in danger. People who deserved protection rather than abandonment to nature's cruelty. Yet sending rescue parties into such conditions would risk the lives of his own people, skilled warriors whose loss would weaken his pack's defenses, when spring brought the inevitable conflicts with neighboring territories. A responsible leader made decisions based on mathematics rather than emotion, accepting unfortunate losses to prevent greater catastrophes. "The storm shows no signs of abating," he said finally, though the words felt like swallowing broken glass. "Rescue attempts would be suicidal folly that serves no constructive purpose." As if summoned by their conversation, Celeste appeared in the study doorway, despite explicit instructions to remain in the nursery during severe weather. Her nurse, Madame Dubois, followed with the harried expression of someone who had discovered that strong-willed children possessed remarkable abilities to evade supervision when determined to reach their objectives. "Papa, we can see the storm from my windows," Celeste announced, moving to his side with the fearless confidence that made his heart clench with protective terror. "It looks angry and hungry, like it wants to swallow everything in the whole world." "Indeed, little star, which is why everyone must remain safely indoors until it passes." He lifted her onto his lap, noting how her small hands were cold despite the castle's warmth. "Storms like this remind us why we build strong walls and keep adequate supplies for difficult times." "But what about the lost people, Papa?" Her violet eyes fixed on his with devastating innocence. "The ones who don't have strong walls to keep them safe? Are they just supposed to freeze because they're not as lucky as we are?" Captain Gaston cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps the young lady should return to her chambers while we discuss military matters, my lord?" "No," Celeste said firmly, settling more comfortably against Lysander's chest. "I want to help the lost people. Papa promised me that strong people protect those who can't protect themselves, and we're the strongest people in all the lands." The echo of his own words, spoken in a moment of parental tenderness, now returned to challenge the cold calculations that governed his public decisions. He had made that promise without considering how thoroughly it might conflict with the pragmatic choices that effective leadership required. "Some situations cannot be improved through good intentions alone," he explained gently, though part of him admired her compassionate instincts, even as they complicated his decision-making process. "Sometimes the kindest choice is accepting that we cannot save everyone without destroying our ability to protect those who depend upon us. But we won't know if we can save them unless we try," she insisted with the relentless logic that children wielded like weapons against adult rationalization. And if we don't try, they'll definitely die, which means we could have helped but chose not to. Thunder crashed overhead with timing that seemed almost supernatural, while wind drove snow against the windows with violence that made the storm's power undeniably clear. Yet Celeste's words had awakened something within Lysander's chest that refused to be silenced through practical arguments or logical objections. Perhaps some promises, once made, demanded honor, regardless of cost or consequence. Chapter 4. Her pup is freezing, Daddy. Against every instinct honed through years of pragmatic leadership, Lysander found himself mounted on his destrier Tonnerre, with Celeste secured before him on the massive warhorse as they rode into the teeth of the storm that had transformed the familiar landscape into an alien world of white fury and deadly beauty. The wind cut through even the finest furs like enemy blades, while snow swirled with hypnotic patterns that could disorient experienced travelers within moments. "Stay close to me," he commanded the 6 guards who had volunteered for this mission, despite understanding its near-suicidal nature. "We follow the Eastern Pass for 1 hour, then return regardless of what we find or fail to find." The decision had crystallized when Celeste's tears finally broke through defenses he'd believed impregnable, her small voice repeating that people were dying while they remained warm and safe. Perhaps it was weakness, perhaps folly, but something deeper than logic had driven him to action that defied every principle of sound leadership. They rode in formation that provided maximum protection for Celeste, while maintaining tactical awareness of terrain that had become treacherously deceptive beneath layers of accumulated snow. Familiar landmarks disappeared beneath white shrouds that transformed the known world into hostile territory, where death waited for the unprepared or unlucky. "Papa, look!" Celeste's sharp cry cut through the wind's howling as she pointed toward what appeared to be a dark mound half buried beneath a snowdrift near the skeletal remains of a shelter that had collapsed under the storm's weight. "Something's moving!" Lysander's enhanced senses detected the acrid scent of fear, pain, and something else that made his wolf stir with sudden alertness, the distinctive fragrance that marked Omega physiology, sweet and vulnerable in ways that triggered every protective instinct bred into alpha genetics over countless generations. Dismounting with fluid grace despite the treacherous conditions, he approached the snow-covered forms while his guards maintained perimeter watch for threats that might exploit their temporary vulnerability. What he found beneath the accumulated snow made his breath catch in his throat with shock that transcended simple surprise. A young woman, unconscious and nearly blue with cold, clutched a bundle to her chest with the desperate determination of someone who would die before releasing her precious burden. Even in her current state, she possessed ethereal beauty that spoke of noble breeding, delicate features that belonged in court portraits rather than abandoned in wilderness to freeze beneath uncaring skies. But it was the bundle she protected that made Celeste gasp with recognition and sympathy, that pierced Lysander's carefully armored heart like sunlight through storm clouds. "Her pup is freezing, Daddy!" Celeste cried, struggling down from Tonnerre's saddle to kneel beside the unconscious woman. "Look how little he is! We have to save them both right now." The infant, perhaps 2 months old at most, had skin that carried the pallor of approaching death, his tiny lips blue with cold that had nearly claimed both mother and child. Yet something about the woman's scent made Lysander's wolf pace restlessly beneath his human consciousness, recognition stirring that defied rational explanation. "Carefully," he instructed as his guards helped him lift both woman and child, noting how she instinctively tightened her grip, even in unconsciousness. "They're both nearly gone from exposure. We need to reach the castle immediately if either is to survive." As he cradled the unconscious Omega against his chest, her scent intensified despite her critical condition. Wild roses and morning rain mixed with something uniquely hers that made his pulse quicken in ways he hadn't experienced since his wife's death. The reaction was immediate, undeniable, and terrifying in its implications. The mate bond. After years of assuming he would never again experience the soul-deep connection that defined wolf partnerships, Fate had delivered his destined mate half frozen in a snowdrift, accompanied by a child whose parentage he didn't know, but whose welfare had already become his responsibility through proximity to the woman who stirred feelings he'd believed permanently buried. "Is she going to die, Papa?" Celeste asked as they rode hard toward the castle, her small hands helping to share body heat with the infant who had begun making weak sounds that might have been attempts at crying. "Not if I can prevent it," Lysander replied grimly, though he understood that surviving the physical effects of exposure was only the beginning of challenges that would follow. An unmarked Omega with a child of unknown parentage would create political complications that could threaten everything he'd built, particularly if his advisors learned about the mate bond that even now sang through his blood like wildfire. Yet as he held her against his chest, feeling her heart beat weakly but steadily against his own, Lysander realized that political complications had become secondary to the primal need to protect what fate had placed in his arms. The storm continued raging around them, but something fundamental had shifted in the carefully ordered world he'd constructed through years of emotional discipline and pragmatic choices. Whether that shift would prove salvation or destruction remained to be seen. Chapter 5. The Recognition. The castle's infirmary had been transformed into a battlefield where life and death waged their eternal struggle, with Brother Antoine and his assistants working desperately to save 2 lives that hung by threads as delicate as spider silk. Lysander stood beside the narrow bed where the unconscious Omega lay wrapped in heated furs, her breathing so shallow that he found himself holding his own breath between each rise and fall of her chest. "The woman shows signs of severe exposure complicated by exhaustion and malnutrition," Brother Antoine reported in the clinical tones he used when delivering dire medical assessments. "Her body temperature remains dangerously low despite our warming efforts, and there are indicators suggesting she's been traveling in harsh conditions for several days before the storm struck." "And the child?" Lysander's voice carried more emotion than he'd intended, revealing the depth of concern that watching the tiny life struggle had awakened within him. "The infant responds better to treatment, though he's severely underweight for his apparent age. Both will require intensive care for the next several days, and their survival remains uncertain despite our best efforts." Celeste sat in a chair beside the bed, having refused all attempts to remove her from the infirmary, despite the impropriety of a young noble lady maintaining vigil over unknown peasants. Her small hand rested gently on the blanket covering the infant, as if her presence alone could provide additional protection against the forces threatening such fragile life. "What's her name, Papa?" she asked quietly. "She needs a name so we can talk to her properly when she wakes up." The question highlighted one of many mysteries surrounding the woman whose rescue had triggered reactions Lysander was still struggling to understand. No identification had been found among her meager possessions, no clues about her origins or circumstances that had led to such desperate flight through dangerous territory during the worst storm of the season. "We'll ask her when she regains consciousness," he replied, though part of him wondered if she would trust them with truth when she awakened in the castle of the most feared alpha in the northern territories. As if responding to their conversation, the woman stirred slightly, her lips parting in what might have been an attempt to speak. Lysander moved closer instinctively, drawn by impulses that operated independently of conscious thought, and the moment his fingers brushed against her fevered forehead, the mate bond flared with intensity that nearly brought him to his knees. Images flooded his consciousness, fragments of memory and emotion that belonged to the woman lying helpless before him. He saw flashes of terror as enemy wolves destroyed a peaceful settlement, felt her desperate love for the child she protected, experienced her determination to reach safety despite overwhelming odds against survival. But beneath those surface impressions lay something deeper and more disturbing. The unmistakable psychic signature of noble breeding, education that spoke of highborn status and secrets that could reshape the political landscape if revealed to the wrong people. "My lord?" Brother Antoine's concerned voice broke through the overwhelming sensory experience. "Are you unwell? You appear pale." "I'm fine," Lysander lied, stepping back from the bed while his mind raced to process implications that grew more complex with each revelation. Continue your care. Spare no expense or effort in ensuring their recovery. Of course, my lord, though I should mention that the woman bears certain markings that suggest noble heritage despite her current circumstances. The infant also shows signs of excellent care prior to their recent hardships. Noble heritage. The confirmation struck Lysander like a physical blow, adding layers of political complication to an already impossible situation. An unmarked omega of noble birth represented either a valuable political asset or a dangerous threat, depending on her specific identity and the circumstances that had led to her current desperate state. What sort of markings? He asked carefully. Though the mate bond was already providing answers he wasn't certain he wanted to receive. Small scars on her wrist that appear consistent with removal of identifying jewelry, traces of expensive cosmetics despite her current condition, and calluses that suggest training in accomplishments typical of court-educated ladies, rather than common-born women. Each detail painted a clearer picture of someone who had deliberately obscured her identity, while fleeing circumstances that posed existential threat. The question was whether those threats followed her to his territory, and whether providing sanctuary would make him an ally or target of whatever forces had driven her to such desperate measures. "Double the guard on this wing of the castle," he commanded. "No one enters without my explicit permission, and send word to Captain Gaston that I require immediate audience regarding intelligence from neighboring territories." As evening settled over the castle, Lysander remained beside the bed where his unexpected mate fought for life, while her child slept peacefully for the first time since their rescue. The mate bond hummed between them like a constant reminder that fate cared nothing for political convenience or careful planning. Tomorrow would bring questions that demanded answers, decisions that could reshape his carefully ordered world, and challenges that would test every principle upon which he'd built his reign. But tonight he simply watched over the woman who had already begun changing everything he thought he knew about duty, desire, and the terrible vulnerability that accompanied love. Chapter 6. The choice dawn brought with it the harsh realities that Lysander had spent the night trying to avoid, as Lord Commander Bastian arrived with intelligence reports that painted disturbing pictures of the political situation surrounding his mysterious guests. The great hall echoed with the sound of boots on stone as his most trusted advisors gathered for an emergency council session that would determine the fate of 2 lives hanging in the balance. "The woman and child you rescued," Bastian began without preamble, his weathered face bearing the expression of someone delivering news that would complicate everything, "have attracted attention from sources we'd prefer to avoid." Lysander settled into his throne with the controlled movements that concealed the tension coiling through his muscles like a spring wound too tightly. The mate bond continued humming in the background of his consciousness, making concentration difficult while providing constant awareness of his mate's slowly improving condition. What manner of attention? "Scouts from the Valdris pack crossed our borders at dawn, claiming pursuit of fugitives who stole valuable property before fleeing into our territory. They demand permission to search the castle and surrounding villages for the criminals they're tracking." The Valdris pack. Lysander's jaw tightened as he considered the implications of their involvement, since Valdris wolves were known throughout the region for their ruthless treatment of anyone who crossed their interests. Their alpha, Renaud Valdris, commanded through fear and brutality that made Lysander's own reputation for harsh justice seem almost merciful by comparison. "And these alleged criminals?" he asked, though the answer was becoming clear with sickening certainty. "A young woman and infant who allegedly murdered her husband before stealing family heirlooms of considerable value. The Valdris representative claims the woman is mentally unstable and dangerous to anyone who provides her assistance." Lord Treasurer Armand shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly calculating the political costs of harboring individuals who had attracted hostile attention from powerful neighbors. "My lord, perhaps accommodation with the Valdris pack would serve our interests better than protecting strangers whose backgrounds we cannot verify." Accommodation? Lysander repeated slowly, letting the word hang in the air like a blade waiting to fall. The suggestion that he surrender his mate to enemies who would undoubtedly torture and kill her triggered protective instincts that made his wolf snarl with barely contained violence. The practical considerations are significant, added Chancellor Olivier, whose talent for political maneuvering had proven valuable in past crises. Valdris commands substantial military resources and maintains alliances that could threaten our trade relationships if unnecessarily provoked by interference in their internal affairs. Internal affairs. Another phrase that tasted like poison on Lysander's tongue, since the mate bond provided growing certainty that whatever had happened to drive his mate into desperate flight, it bore no resemblance to the official Valdris narrative. Through the bond, he could sense fragments of truth that painted a very different picture. A forced marriage to a brutal alpha who viewed omegas as property to be used and discarded. Systematic abuse that had escalated when she'd given birth to a child whose parentage her husband questioned. And a final night of terror when escape became the only alternative to death. "What response have you given to the Valdris demands?" he asked, though his decision was already crystallizing despite the political costs it would inevitably carry. "I informed them that all requests for territorial access must be approved by your lordship personally," Bastian replied diplomatically. "They await your decision regarding their proposed search." Celeste chose that moment to enter the Great Hall, having apparently escaped her tutors again in her determination to check on the people they'd rescued from the storm. Her presence served as a reminder of the promise he'd made about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, words that now carried weight far beyond what he'd intended when speaking to comfort a worried child. "How are our guests, little star?" he asked gently, noting how her small face brightened with hope and concern. "The lady opened her eyes for a few minutes this morning, Papa. She looked scared until I told her she was safe now, and then she smiled before falling asleep again." Celeste's expression grew serious as she studied the assembled advisors. "Brother Antoine says they're both getting stronger, but they need lots of rest and good food to get completely better." "That's wonderful news." He lifted her onto his lap, drawing comfort from her warm presence while his mind finalized the decision that would reshape their world. "And what did you think of the lady when she was awake?" "She has kind eyes even though they're sad. And she kept looking toward her baby like she was making sure he was safe. The way you look at me sometimes when you think I might be in danger." The innocent observation struck him with devastating accuracy, since a mother's protective instincts deserved recognition and respect rather than dismissal based on political convenience. Whatever crimes the Valdris Pact claimed had been committed, they paled beside the greater crime of separating a mother from her child or delivering innocence to those who would certainly destroy them. "Lord Commander," he said finally, his voice carrying the authority that ended debate before it could begin, "inform the Valdris representatives that no fugitives matching their description have been found within our territory. Their search request is denied, and they have until sunset to remove themselves from our lands." Gasps echoed through the chamber as advisors processed the implications of protecting unknown refugees against the demands of powerful neighbors. Chancellor Olivier's face had gone pale with understanding of the diplomatic crisis that was about to unfold. "My lord," he said carefully, "perhaps additional consideration of the consequences. My decision is final." Lysander's tone carried enough steel to silence further objections. "We do not surrender guests who have claimed sanctuary within our borders, regardless of accusations made by those who would profit from their capture." As his advisors departed with obvious reluctance to implement policies they viewed as dangerously impractical, Lysander held Celeste close while contemplating the magnitude of what he'd just committed to defending. The mate bond sang with approval, promising that some choices, regardless of their costs, were simply right. Chapter 7. The Awakening. 3 days after the rescue that had changed everything, Lysander sat vigil beside the infirmary bed where his mate finally showed signs of genuine consciousness, rather than the fevered delirium that had characterized her previous brief wakeful moments. Her violet eyes, so similar to Celeste's that the resemblance was almost supernatural, focused on his face with awareness that made his breath catch in his throat. "Where?" she began, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying a musical quality that made his wolf purr with satisfaction deep within his chest. "You're safe," he said immediately, leaning forward to ensure she could hear him clearly. "You and your child are in Chateau Frostveil under my protection. The storm has passed, and both of you are recovering well from your ordeal." Recognition flickered in her eyes. Not of him personally, but of the implications of being rescued by the notorious alpha whose reputation for ruthless justice was known throughout the Northern Territories. Fear replaced confusion, as she apparently realized the potential danger of her situation, despite his assurances of safety. "My son," she whispered urgently, attempting to sit up despite obvious weakness that made the effort almost impossible. "Where is my son? They said he was dead, but I heard him crying when you found us." "He's here," Lysander assured her, gesturing toward the small cradle that Brother Antoine had positioned beside her bed. "Healthy and growing stronger every day. You protected him well during circumstances that would have defeated less determined mothers." Tears began streaming down her face as she looked toward the sleeping infant, relief and love combining in an expression that struck Lysander with its raw honesty. Whatever this woman had endured, her devotion to her child was absolute and unquestionable. "I remember the storm," she said slowly, as if testing her ability to trust him with truth. "And voices calling out, warmth when I thought we would surely freeze. But everything else seems like fragments of dreams that might not be real. The rescue was real. My daughter Celeste spotted you buried in the snow and insisted that we couldn't leave anyone to die in such conditions." He paused, noting how her eyes widened at the mention of Celeste. "She's been visiting regularly to check on your recovery, though Brother Antoine has limited her access to prevent overtiring you." "Your daughter saved our lives?" Wonder colored her voice as she processed the idea that salvation had come through a child's compassion rather than adult calculation. "Her conscience saved your lives. I merely provided the means to act upon her moral certainty that strong people should protect those who cannot protect themselves." A comfortable silence settled between them as she absorbed the implications of being rescued by someone whose reputation suggested little tolerance for weakness or inconvenience. When she spoke again, her voice carried careful consideration of how much truth to reveal. "I am Marguerite," she said finally. "And this is my son, Henri. We were traveling to distant relatives when the storm trapped us in conditions we were not prepared to survive." Marguerite. The name suited her perfectly, conjuring images of delicate flowers that possessed surprising resilience despite their apparent fragility. Yet the mate bond provided awareness that her simple introduction concealed far more complex truths about identity and circumstances that had led to such desperate flight. "Lady Marguerite," he replied formally, noting how she flinched slightly at the title. "I am Lysander de Frostveil, alpha of these territories. You and your son are welcome to remain as guests until you have fully recovered and decided upon your future course." "You don't understand," she said urgently, fear creeping back into her expression. "There are people who will come looking for us, dangerous people who won't respect boundaries or diplomatic courtesies. By helping us, you may have placed yourself and your daughter in terrible danger. Then they will discover that threatening my guests constitutes threatening me directly," he replied with quiet certainty that made his wolf's presence apparent in the subtle shift of his scent. "And I have never yet encountered threats that I could not address through appropriate application of force." The conversation was interrupted by Celeste's arrival, having apparently convinced her guardians that checking on the recovered patients represented educational rather than merely social activity. "Lady Marguerite!" she exclaimed with delight that immediately brightened the room's atmosphere. "You're really awake and talking. I was worried that you might sleep forever like the princess in the story about the cursed spindle." "Hello, little one," Marguerite replied with the first genuine smile Lysander had seen from her. I understand that I owe my life to your sharp eyes and kind heart. Papa did the actual saving, Celeste said with characteristic honesty. But I helped by spotting you in the snow and making sure he understood that we couldn't just leave you there to freeze. As Lysander watched his daughter chatter with the woman who was slowly becoming real rather than merely an obligation to be protected, he realized that Marguerite's presence would change far more than his personal life. Celeste had been alone among adults for too long, and having another female presence, particularly one who responded to her naturally, rather than with the careful deference that marked other court interactions, would be beneficial for her development. The mate bond hummed with contentment as he observed the easy rapport developing between his daughter and his destined mate, suggesting that some blessings, however unexpected, might prove worth any challenges they brought. Chapter 8. The Court's Displeasure. The morning council session carried an atmosphere of barely controlled tension as Lysander faced advisors whose expressions ranged from diplomatic concern to poorly concealed alarm regarding his decision to harbor mysterious refugees despite threats from powerful neighbors. The Great Hall seemed smaller than usual, weighed down by collective disapproval that made even breathing feel like an act of defiance. The Valdris representatives departed at sunset as commanded. Lord Commander Bastian reported with professional neutrality that couldn't quite mask his personal reservations. However, their parting words suggested that this matter would not be concluded through simple territorial boundaries. Meaning? Lysander asked, though the mate bond had been providing increasingly detailed impressions of the forces arrayed against Marguerite and her son, a web of political alliances, financial interests, and personal vendettas that extended far beyond simple domestic disputes. Meaning that Alpha Renault Valdris views your protection of his property as theft that demands correction through whatever means prove necessary. Chancellor Olivier replied grimly. He has formal treaty obligations with 3 neighboring pacts, all of whom benefit from trade relationships that your interference now threatens. Property. The word made Lysander's wolf snarl with protective fury barely contained beneath the careful controls he'd developed over years of civilized leadership. The idea that Marguerite could be viewed as property, rather than a person deserving protection, violated every principle of justice he'd sworn to uphold. Lady Marguerite is a guest who claimed sanctuary within our borders, he said evenly, though his voice carried undertones that made several advisors shift uncomfortably. Neither property nor criminal, but a person entitled to protection under the ancient laws that govern hospitality and refuge. Ancient laws, Lord Treasurer Armand repeated skeptically, that modern politics may not recognize when pressed by practical considerations of trade and military alliance. The financial consequences alone could be devastating if our commercial relationships suffer due to this charitable gesture. Furthermore, added Lord Henry de Montfort, whose family controlled significant territory along the southern borders, harboring fugitives creates precedent that could encourage others to seek refuge from justice within our lands. The implications for maintaining order could prove serious. Each objection struck against the foundations of Lysander's decision, while providing compelling arguments for reversing course before consequences became irreversible. Yet the mate bond pulsed with certainty that abandoning Marguerite would constitute betrayal of everything he claimed to represent about strength protecting the vulnerable. Has anyone considered, he said quietly, investigating the truth of accusations made by those who demand surrender of people they claim as property? Or do we simply accept that might makes right when convenient for our economic interests? The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, challenging assumptions that had governed diplomatic relationships for generations. Most conflicts were resolved through careful weighing of relative power, rather than moral consideration of underlying justice. My lord, Chancellor Olivier said carefully, such investigations would require access to internal affairs of sovereign territories, which could be viewed as hostile interference, regardless of our intentions. While the woman herself, added Armand with obvious distaste, has provided no verifiable information about her identity or circumstances. We risk everything based on nothing more than assumed innocence that may be entirely misplaced. Before Lysander could respond to arguments that were both logical and infuriating, a commotion in the corridor announced an arrival that would reshape the entire discussion. Captain Gaston entered with quick steps that suggested urgent news requiring immediate attention. "My lord, forgive the interruption, but we have received formal communication from the Continental Alliance regarding the situation with your guests." The Continental Alliance. Lysander felt ice forming in his stomach as he considered the implications of involvement by the political organization that coordinated relationships between major pacts throughout the known world. Their intervention typically meant that local disputes had escalated beyond simple bilateral disagreements. What does the alliance require? A formal hearing regarding allegations of theft, murder, and violation of territorial sovereignty. Captain Gaston replied with the expression of someone delivering a death sentence. To be held within a fortnight at neutral territory, with binding arbitration of all claims made by involved parties. Silence descended over the chamber as advisors processed the magnitude of the political crisis that was developing around two refugees who might or might not deserve the protection being offered. The alliance's involvement meant that Lysander's decisions would face scrutiny from judges who prioritized political stability over individual justice. "And if we refuse to participate in this hearing?" he asked, though the answer was predictable. Economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and potential military intervention to resolve matters through force rather than negotiation, Chancellor Olivier replied with resignation. Essentially, they would treat our refusal as a declaration of independence from the entire system of international law. As his advisors began discussing contingency plans that all seemed to involve surrendering Marguerite to avoid a larger catastrophe, Lysander realized that protecting his mate would require confronting not just individual enemies, but the entire political structure that enabled such abuse. The question was whether love and justice combined could triumph over a system designed to prioritize convenience over compassion. Chapter 9. The walls crack evening brought blessed privacy to Lysander's study, where he found himself staring into flames that danced in the great hearth while his mind wrestled with political complications that grew more severe with each passing hour. The mate bond provided constant awareness of Marguerite's emotional state as she recovered in the infirmary, her fear and gratitude combining in ways that made concentration nearly impossible. A soft knock interrupted his brooding, and Brother Antoine entered with the careful expression of someone bearing news that might not be welcome. "Lady Marguerite has requested a private audience with your lordship," the healer announced diplomatically. "She claims urgent matters that require discussion before tomorrow's council session addressing the alliance demands." Lysander set aside the wine he'd been nursing while contemplating impossible choices, understanding that whatever Marguerite wished to discuss would likely complicate an already untenable situation. Yet the mate bond pulled at him with irresistible force, demanding proximity to the woman who was becoming more necessary to his well-being with each passing day. "Escort me to her," he commanded, following Brother Antoine through corridors that echoed with the sounds of a castle settling into nighttime routines. He found Marguerite sitting beside Henri's cradle, her recovery evident in improved color and stronger posture, though shadows beneath her eyes spoke of sleep interrupted by nightmares that healing potions couldn't address. She wore a simple gown provided by the castle seamstresses, yet managed to make even plain fabric appear elegant through natural grace that suggested noble breeding, despite her current circumstances. "My lord," she said formally, rising with fluid movement that made his breath catch. "Thank you for agreeing to speak with me despite the late hour and irregular nature of my request." "Please sit," he replied, settling into a chair positioned where they could converse quietly without disturbing the sleeping infant. Brother Antoine mentioned urgent matters requiring discussion. "I must tell you the truth about who I am, and why Alpha Valdris pursues us with such determination," she began without preamble, violet eyes meeting his directly despite obvious fear of his reaction. You deserve to understand the full scope of danger that protecting us has brought to your territory. The mate bond hummed with anticipation as she gathered courage to reveal secrets that had driven her to desperate flight through deadly weather. Lysander found himself leaning forward, drawn by more than simple curiosity about the woman whose welfare had become central to his existence. "I am Marguerite de Beaumont," she continued, the noble surname carrying weight that made several puzzle pieces fall into place. "Youngest daughter of the late Alpha Christophe de Beaumont, who ruled the Moonhaven territory until his death 3 years ago." Moonhaven. Lysander's mind raced through implications of her heritage, since the Beaumont pack had controlled valuable trade routes until their territory was absorbed by the Valdres pack following a succession dispute that had left several claimants dead under suspicious circumstances. "You were presumed killed during the territorial integration," he said quietly, understanding beginning to dawn about forces that had driven her into hiding. "My uncle arranged my supposed death to protect me from Alpha Valdres, who intended to eliminate all Beaumont heirs to prevent future challenges to his authority." Her voice carried pain that went beyond physical suffering. "I lived in exile under assumed identity until Henri's father discovered my true heritage and decided that marrying Alpha Christophe's daughter would legitimize his own claims to Moonhaven territory." Each revelation added layers of political complexity that transformed her situation from simple domestic dispute into struggle over valuable territories and ancient claims that could reshape the balance of power throughout the region. Yet the mate bond provided awareness that her personal suffering mattered more than any political considerations. "And Henri's father?" "Murdered me in stages," she said simply, though the words carried weight that made Lysander's wolf growl with protective fury. "When I gave birth to a son who might inherit claims he couldn't control, the abuse escalated until escape became the only alternative to death for both of us." The clinical way she described systematic torture spoke of trauma too great for emotional processing, survival achieved through compartmentalization that allowed function despite devastating pain. Lysander recognized the defensive mechanisms because he'd employed similar strategies following his own losses. "The night you fled?" He announced his intention to kill Henri and find a more suitable wife who would produce controllable heirs. Her hands trembled as she relived memories that still carried power to wound. "I took only what we could carry and ran into the storm, preferring to die free rather than watch my child murdered for political convenience." Silence settled between them as Lysander absorbed the full scope of injustice that had driven his mate to his territory. The political implications were staggering, but the personal reality of her courage in protecting her son despite impossible odds filled him with admiration that transcended mere attraction. "Why tell me this now?" he asked gently. "Surely revealing your identity increases rather than decreases the danger to everyone involved. Because you deserve truth before making decisions that could destroy everything you've built," she replied with honesty that made the mate bond sing with harmony. "I am not worth war with the alliance or economic ruin for your people. Better that I disappear again than watch good people suffer for my sake." The suggestion that she might flee again triggered protective instincts that made his wolf snarl with absolute rejection of any scenario that involved losing his mate after finally finding her. "You will not disappear," he said with quiet authority that made her eyes widen. "Whatever challenges arise, we will face them together." Together? Hope and fear warred in her expression as she processed implications of his promise. "Together," he confirmed, understanding that he'd just committed to defending not only her life, but her claim to territory that could reshape the political landscape throughout the northern kingdoms. The mate bond pulsed with righteous purpose as he realized that love and justice had finally found common cause worth any sacrifice. Chapter 10. The Political Price. The emergency council session convened at dawn carried an atmosphere thick with recrimination and barely controlled panic, as Lysander's advisors processed intelligence reports that painted increasingly dire pictures of the political crisis developing around his protection of Lady Marguerite. Maps covered the great table, marked with hostile troop movements and economic sanctions that threatened to strangle trade relationships built over decades. 17 merchant caravans have been turned away from Valdris territory, Lord Treasurer Armand reported with visible distress. 3 major contracts for spring wool exports have been cancelled, and our grain suppliers demand immediate payment rather than traditional credit terms. Furthermore, added Chancellor Olivier grimly, the Alliance has expanded their investigation to include questions about your fitness to rule, citing emotional instability as evidenced by protection of accused criminals against legitimate territorial claims. Each piece of bad news struck like physical blows against Lysander's carefully constructed position, yet the mate bond provided a constant reminder that abandoning Marguerite would constitute betrayal of everything he claimed to represent about justice and protection of the innocent. Lord Commander, he said evenly, what military intelligence supports these economic pressures? Valdris forces are massing along our southern border under pretext of training exercises. Bastian replied with professional calm that couldn't quite mask underlying concern. Additionally, 2 Alliance patrol groups have been observed conducting reconnaissance of our defensive positions. How many troops total? Approximately 3,000 infantry, 800 cavalry, with siege equipment being assembled at forward positions that suggest preparation for extended operations, rather than simple intimidation tactics. The numbers were sobering, but not insurmountable, particularly given that Chateau Frostveil had been designed to withstand sieges by forces significantly larger than what their enemies could currently field, yet prolonged conflict would exact costs in lives and resources that might prove devastating regardless of ultimate victory. My lord, Lord Henri de Montfort said carefully, perhaps the time has come to consider diplomatic solutions that serve everyone's interests while avoiding unnecessary bloodshed. What manner of solutions? Lysander asked, though he suspected the answer would involve abandoning the woman who had become essential to his existence. Negotiated surrender of the fugitives in exchange for guarantees about their treatment, combined with formal apology that acknowledges the misunderstanding while reaffirming our respect for territorial sovereignty. Negotiated surrender. The euphemism couldn't disguise what such diplomacy would actually entail, delivering his mate to enemies who would certainly torture and kill her while claiming to act within legal frameworks that legitimized systematic abuse. And what guarantees could possibly ensure humane treatment of people who are viewed as property by those who claim ownership? Chancellor Olivier shifted uncomfortably before answering. The Alliance would oversee transfer and subsequent treatment, ensuring that justice is administered according to established legal precedents rather than personal vengeance. Legal precedents, Lysander repeated slowly, letting contempt color his voice as he considered how laws could be twisted to justify almost any cruelty when applied by those with sufficient power and influence. The discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Captain Gaston, whose expression suggested additional complications that would further limit available options. My lord, urgent communication from the Continental Alliance regarding tomorrow's deadline for response to their arbitration demands. What new requirements do they impose? Personal appearance by all parties involved in the alleged crimes, including Lady Marguerite and her child, to provide testimony under oath regarding the circumstances that led to the current territorial dispute. Personal appearance. Lysander felt his wolf snarl with protective fury at the idea of delivering his mate to enemies who would use such opportunity to eliminate their primary threat while maintaining pretense of legal proceedings. And if the accused parties are unable to appear due to continued medical concerns, then their guilt is assumed proven and territorial sovereignty takes precedence over sanctuary claims, Captain Gaston replied grimly. Essentially, they would authorize whatever measures Alpha Valdris deems appropriate for recovering his stolen property. As his advisors began discussing strategies for limiting damage through careful compliance with alliance demands, Lysander realized that the political system itself was designed to favor those with power over those seeking justice. Gentlemen, he said finally, his voice carrying authority that ended debate before it could develop further, prepare contingency plans for defending the castle against siege. We will not be surrendering our guests to enemies who would certainly destroy them." "My lord," Chancellor Olivier protested, "such defiance could result in economic and military consequences that destroy everything we've built over generations." "Then we will build something better from the ruins," Lysander replied with certainty that made the mate bond sing with approval. "Some principles are worth defending regardless of cost." As his advisors departed with obvious reluctance to implement policies they viewed as suicidal, Lysander contemplated the transformation that had occurred within him since finding Marguerite buried in snow. The cold calculation that had governed his reign was giving way to something warmer and more dangerous, a willingness to risk everything for love and justice that transcended mere political convenience. Whether that transformation would prove salvation or destruction remained to be seen. Chapter 11. The Midpoint Revelation. The afternoon brought unexpected visitors whose arrival would reshape Lysander's understanding of the forces arrayed against his mate and child. Brother Francois, an elderly monk from the distant abbey of Sainte Clotilde, approached the castle under the banner of ecclesiastical neutrality that granted safe passage even during times of political tension. "Your lordship," Brother Francois began after formal greetings had been completed in the Great Hall, "I bring information regarding Lady Marguerite de Beaumont that may alter your perspective on current circumstances." Lysander felt tension coil through his muscles as he prepared for revelations that would likely complicate an already impossible situation. The mate bond provided awareness that Marguerite was resting peacefully in the infirmary, unaware that her past was about to be examined by those whose judgment could determine her future. "What information do you possess about events that occurred before Lady Marguerite sought sanctuary within our territory?" "Complete records," Brother Francois replied, producing a leather satchel filled with documents that appeared to span several years, including marriage contracts, property transfers, testimony from witnesses to systematic abuse, and documentation of the conspiracy that resulted in Alpha Christoph's assassination. Assassination. The word struck the assembled council like thunder, since official records indicated that the Beaumont Alpha had died during a hunting accident that prompted territorial reorganization under Valdres administration. Yet the mate bond had been providing impressions of deeper treachery that made such alternative explanations entirely plausible. "You possess evidence that Alpha Christophe was murdered?" "Irrefutable proof that his death was planned and executed by Alpha Valdres in coordination with several other pack leaders who stood to benefit from destabilization of Beaumont territory," the monk confirmed grimly. Lady Marguerite's supposed death was arranged to protect the sole surviving heir from a similar fate. Brother Francois spread documents across the council table with careful precision, revealing a web of political conspiracy that had been years in the making. Marriage contracts showed how Marguerite had been used as pawn in larger games of territorial acquisition, while witness testimony detailed abuse that escalated far beyond typical domestic violence into systematic torture designed to break her spirit completely. "Moreover," the monk continued, "Lady Marguerite's son Henri is not the child of her abusive husband, but the legitimate heir of Lord Philippe de Montclair, who was murdered when he attempted to rescue her from captivity." The revelation struck Lysander with devastating force as he realized that Henri carried bloodlines that could legitimately challenge not only Valdres' territorial claims, but several other disputed successions throughout the region. The infant sleeping peacefully in the castle infirmary was potentially one of the most politically valuable people in the northern kingdoms. "Which explains," added Brother Francois with obvious satisfaction, "why Alpha Valdres is so desperate to reclaim custody of both mother and child. Their existence threatens the entire network of territorial acquisitions that have been built upon fraudulent claims and systematic murder." Lord Commander Bastian leaned forward to study documents that detailed military movements and financial transactions spanning 3 years. "These records suggest coordination between at least 6 major packs in conspiracy to eliminate Beaumont influence permanently. Indeed, what you face is not a simple territorial dispute, but organized effort to prevent exposure of crimes that could destabilize the entire Continental Alliance if brought to light during formal proceedings." Lysander felt pieces of the larger puzzle clicking into place as he understood why his protection of 2 refugees had triggered such a massive political response. They weren't just harboring individuals fleeing domestic abuse. They were protecting evidence that could expose corruption reaching to the highest levels of regional government. "Why bring this information to us?" he asked. Surely neutral ecclesiastical authority would prefer avoiding involvement in such dangerous political matters. "Because," Brother Francois replied with quiet dignity, "sometimes moral obligation supersedes political convenience. Lady Marguerite and her son represent innocents whose suffering serves no purpose beyond maintaining power structures built upon systematic injustice." The documents painted a picture of conspiracy so comprehensive that traditional diplomatic solutions would prove not only inadequate, but actually dangerous, since any formal hearing would provide opportunities for eliminating witnesses before truth could be established. "What do you recommend as an appropriate response to this information?" "Expose everything," the monk said simply. "Demand full investigation of Alpha Christoph's death, present evidence of systematic abuse and murder, force the Alliance to choose between protecting their members' reputation and upholding the principles of justice they claim to represent." As Brother Francois departed with promises to provide additional testimony if needed, Lysander realized that protecting Marguerite had become far more than personal obligation. It was fight for the soul of the political system that governed their world. The mate bond pulsed with grim satisfaction as he understood that love and justice had found a common enemy worthy of whatever sacrifices might be required for victory. The real war was just beginning, and this time the stakes included not only their personal happiness, but the fundamental question of whether power would serve justice or continue protecting itself through whatever means proved necessary. Chapter 12. The Hunt. Begin's night fell over Chateau Frostveil with ominous silence that made even seasoned guards nervous as they maintained watch from battlements that had witnessed 3 centuries of conflicts. Lysander moved through corridors with heightened awareness that came from years of military training, combined with wolf senses that detected danger before human consciousness could identify specific threats. The attack came during the changing of the guard, precisely timed to exploit the brief moment when defensive positions were most vulnerable to coordinated assault. Lysander was reviewing documents in his study when sounds of steel meeting steel echoed through stone corridors that had been peaceful moments before. "Assassins!" Captain Gaston's voice boomed through the castle as alarm bells began ringing with urgent cadence that brought every warrior to battle readiness. "They're heading toward the infirmary." Ice flooded Lysander's veins as he realized that enemies had somehow penetrated castle defenses specifically to eliminate Marguerite and Henri, while they remained vulnerable from their recent ordeal. The mate bond flared with protective fury that transformed civilized thought into a primitive need to destroy anything that threatened his family. He moved through corridors with lethal grace that years of comfortable living hadn't diminished, ancient sword singing as it cleared its sheath for the first time in months. Behind him, loyal guards followed with grim determination to protect their alpha's chosen mate against forces that had violated sacred sanctuary. The infirmary corridor had become a battlefield where castle defenders faced professionals whose skills suggested extensive training in rapid elimination of specific targets. Brother Antoine lay motionless beside an overturned table, though whether from injury or prudent unconsciousness remained unclear in the chaos of combat. "Where is she?" demanded the lead assassin, pressing his attack against Captain Gaston with technique that spoke of noble training perverted to murderous purpose. "Surrender the Beaumont heir and her bastard, and deaths will be limited to necessary minimums." "The only death that will occur," Lysander snarled as he entered the fray with controlled violence that had been refined through years of frontier warfare, "is yours." What followed was not combat in any civilized sense, but systematic destruction of threats that had dared to enter his territory with intention of harming those under his protection. The assassins possessed skill and determination, but they faced an alpha whose protective instincts had been awakened by direct attack against his mate and child. Steel sang through air thick with scent of blood and fear, as Lysander carved through enemies with efficiency that reminded everyone present why he was feared throughout the northern territories. Each strike carried not only technical precision, but emotional intensity that transformed simple weapons into instruments of divine retribution. When silence finally returned to the infirmary, 6 bodies lay cooling on stones that would require extensive cleaning to remove evidence of what happened to those who threatened innocent people within reach of protective authority. The remaining assassins had fled through windows rather than face continued resistance from defenders who clearly valued their charges more than their own lives. "Lady Marguerite?" Lysander called softly, approaching the alcove where she had hidden with Henri during the attack. "Here," came her trembling reply as she emerged from behind an overturned cabinet, clutching her son with desperate intensity while violet eyes wide with terror searched for additional threats. "You're safe now," he assured her, though they both understood that this attack represented the beginning rather than conclusion of efforts to eliminate them. "But we need to move you to more secure quarters immediately." "This won't be the last attempt," she said quietly, displaying courage that impressed him despite circumstances that would have broken weaker spirits. "Alpha Valdris has resources and connections that make hiding impossible for extended periods." "Then we stop hiding," Lysander replied grimly, understanding that defensive measures alone would prove inadequate against enemies who possessed sufficient determination and resources to breach castle security. "Tomorrow we begin taking the fight to those who threaten innocent people." As Brother Antoine was confirmed alive, though unconscious, and guards began implementing enhanced security measures that would make future infiltration far more difficult, Lysander realized that the time for diplomatic solutions had ended. The enemy had chosen to wage war through assassination and terror rather than legal proceedings or honorable combat. Such tactics demanded responses that prioritized victory over political convenience, effectiveness over traditional restraint. The mate bond hummed with savage satisfaction as he contemplated teaching their enemies why threatening his family had been the last mistake they would ever make. Some battles were fought for territory or resources, others for principles or pride. But the war that was beginning would be fought for love, justice, and the right of innocent people to exist, without fear of those who viewed murder as an acceptable political tool. His enemies had made the choice to escalate beyond civilized bounds. Now they would discover what lay beyond the restraints that had previously limited his responses to their provocations. Chapter 13. The public claim dawn brought with it the most significant political gathering in Chateau Frostveil's history, as Lysander summoned every noble, merchant, and influential citizen within his territory to witness decisions that would reshape not only his personal life, but the fundamental principles upon which his reign was based. The great hall filled with voices that buzzed with speculation about why their alpha had called such an unprecedented assembly. Marguerite stood beside his throne wearing a gown of deep blue silk that had belonged to his late wife, the formal attire transforming her from refugee patient into the noble lady her heritage proclaimed. Henri rested in her arms, small face peaceful despite the momentous events unfolding around his young life. "Lords and ladies of Frostveil," Lysander began, his voice carrying across the vast chamber with authority that immediately silenced all conversation. "You have been summoned to witness decisions that will determine our territory's future during the trials that approach our borders." Murmurs rippled through the assembled crowd as they processed implications of formal language that suggested developments far beyond routine administrative announcements. Several nobles shifted uncomfortably, apparently suspecting that comfortable political arrangements were about to be disrupted. 3 nights passed. Assassins violated the sanctuary of this castle with intent to murder innocents who had claimed our protection. Their failure to achieve their murderous objectives does not diminish the significance of their attempt, nor the response that such violation demands. He gestured toward Marguerite with movements that carried ceremonial weight despite the informal nature of their current circumstances. Lady Marguerite de Beaumont and her son Henri have faced persecution that violates every principle of justice upon which civilized society depends. Yet rather than offering protection, the Continental Alliance demands their surrender to enemies who would certainly destroy them. Gasps echoed through the chamber as nobles realized they were witnessing direct challenge to political authorities that governed relationships between all northern territories. Several advisors looked pale with understanding of the diplomatic crisis that was about to unfold. Therefore, Lysander continued with a voice that carried absolute certainty, despite the magnitude of consequences that would follow, I publicly declare Lady Marguerite de Beaumont as my chosen mate and future queen of this realm. The explosion of shocked exclamations that followed his declaration made the castle walls seem to tremble with collective amazement. Never in 3 centuries of Frostveil history had an alpha chosen mate based on love rather than political advantage, particularly when such choice threatened established alliances and trade relationships. Furthermore, he added as the noise began to subside, I formally recognize young Henri as my adopted heir, with all rights and privileges that such recognition carries under both ancient law and modern precedent. Chancellor Olivier appeared to be struggling with apoplexy as he processed implications of decisions that rendered years of careful diplomatic work completely obsolete. Other advisors showed similar signs of distress at watching their alpha systematically demolish political arrangements they had spent careers building. The Continental Alliance has demanded surrender of people who are now family members protected by every law that governs royal prerogatives. Any attempt to remove them from this territory will be treated as an act of war against the sovereign domain. Lord Commander Bastian stepped forward with formal precision that marked significant ceremonial moments. Will your lordship require formal witnesses to the declaration of bonding between Alpha and chosen mate? Immediately, Lysander confirmed, extending his hand toward Marguerite with a gesture that invited her participation in reshaping both their lives. The bonding ceremony that followed was brief, but carried weight that transformed legal recognition into spiritual union, witnessed by hundreds of people whose testimony would make dissolution impossible through political pressure. When Marguerite spoke her vows of partnership and mutual protection, the mate bond flared with intensity that left both participants breathless with connection, that transcended mere physical attraction. By ancient right and modern authority, Lysander declared as the ceremony concluded, I present Lady Marguerite de Frostveil, queen of this realm and mother to my heir. The applause that followed was mixed with undercurrents of concern, excitement, and speculation about consequences that would ripple throughout the political landscape. Yet, as Lysander looked upon his mate and adopted son, he felt certain that some decisions, regardless of their costs, were simply right. Now, he continued with a voice that carried the promise of the battles to come, we prepare to defend our choices against those who believe that power grants authority to destroy innocent lives for political convenience. The public declaration had made retreat impossible, while ensuring that whatever followed would test every principle upon which his reign had been built. Yet the mate bond sang with righteous purpose as he contemplated facing the future with family worth any sacrifice. Some wars were fought for territory, others for resources. But the conflict approaching would be waged for love, justice, and the right of people to choose their own destinies, despite opposition from those who preferred control over freedom. The real battle was about to begin, and this time victory would require more than strategic brilliance or military strength. It would demand courage to transform the very foundations upon which their world operated. Chapter 14. The Rebellion. The afternoon following Lysander's public declaration brought the inevitable political crisis, as approximately half his noble supporters requested urgent private audiences to express concerns about decisions they viewed as catastrophically imprudent. The study was filled with tension thick enough to cut as Lord Henri de Montfort led a delegation, whose expressions ranged from diplomatic disapproval to barely concealed outrage. My lord, Lord Henri began with careful formality that couldn't quite mask underlying anger. We come as loyal vassals concerned about implications of yesterday's unprecedented announcements. Speak freely, Lysander replied, though his voice carried undertones that suggested freedom of speech might prove more dangerous than diplomatic silence. The marriage alliance with Duchess Celestine of Avalmont represented a cornerstone of our southern defense strategy, Chancellor Olivier said bluntly. Her father has now withdrawn all military support while demanding return of substantial dowry payments made in anticipation of formal betrothal. Additionally, added Lord Treasurer Armand with obvious distress, 3 major trade partnerships have been terminated effective immediately, while banking relationships that finance our spring planting are suddenly subject to review by institutions with obvious alliance connections. Each piece of bad news struck like calculated blows designed to demonstrate the financial costs of choosing love over political convenience. Yet the mate bond provided a constant reminder that some prices, however steep, were worth paying for principles that mattered more than mere comfort. Lord Commander, Lysander said evenly, what military intelligence supports these economic pressures? Alliance forces have increased to approximately 5,000 troops positioned along our borders, Bastion replied professionally. Additionally, several of our own vassal lords have requested permission to withdraw their household guards for defensive purposes that suggest preparation for extended conflict. Which lords have made such requests? The silence that followed his question provided an answer that struck him with unexpected force. Nearly a third of his military strength was controlled by nobles whose loyalty had apparently been conditional upon political decisions that served their personal interests rather than abstract principles of justice. My lord, Lord Henri said carefully, perhaps accommodation might still be possible through diplomatic channels that acknowledge changed circumstances while avoiding unnecessary destruction. What manner of accommodation? Lysander asked, though he suspected any solution would involve abandoning the woman who had become essential to his existence. Annulment of yesterday's hasty ceremony based on coercion or temporary emotional instability, Chancellor Olivier suggested, with the expression of someone proposing reasonable compromise rather than devastating betrayal. Combined with negotiated surrender of the fugitives under conditions that ensure humane treatment through alliance oversight. Annulment. The word made Lysander's wolf snarl with protective fury at the suggestion that their mate bond could be dissolved through political convenience or legal technicalities. The connection forged between himself and Marguerite transcended human law while operating according to forces that politics could neither understand nor control. And if I refuse such accommodation? Then loyal subjects may be forced to consider whether individual preference should be allowed to threaten the welfare of thousands who depend upon wise leadership, Lord Henry replied, with obvious reluctance to voice threats he'd hoped wouldn't prove necessary. The challenge was politely phrased but unmistakable in its implications. Submit to political pressure or face rebellion by those who had sworn loyalty, but apparently interpreted such oaths as conditional upon decisions that served their approval. I see, Lysander said quietly, noting which faces showed sympathy versus those that revealed calculations about shifting allegiances to serve personal advantage. And how many share these concerns about my fitness to rule? Enough, Chancellor Olivier replied grimly, to make continued resistance politically impossible unless your lordship possesses resources we haven't considered. As the delegation departed with obvious reluctance to implement ultimatums they'd hoped wouldn't prove necessary, Lysander realized that protecting his mate would require confronting not only external enemies, but internal opposition from people he'd trusted to support difficult decisions. The mate bond pulsed with grim determination as he contemplated the loneliness of leadership when principles conflicted with popular opinion. Yet some choices, once made, demanded defense regardless of consequences or costs. Love and justice had made him enemies among friends while revealing that true loyalty was rarer than he'd believed. Now he would discover whether courage and determination could triumph over political calculation and expedient betrayal. The rebellion had begun, and only time would reveal whether a king who chose love over convenience could survive the storm that was gathering around his transformed heart. Chapter 15. The Ultimatum. The siege began at dawn with systematic precision that spoke of professional military planning, designed to maximize psychological pressure while minimizing actual bloodshed during initial phases. Lysander stood upon the battlements, watching enemy forces establish defensive positions that transformed familiar landscape into hostile territory, where death waited for anyone foolish enough to venture beyond castle walls. Approximately 6,000 troops total. Lord Commander Bastian reported with calm professionalism that concealed underlying concern about odds that had become significantly worse overnight. 3 separate contingents representing alliance forces, Valdris Pack military, and mercenary companies whose presence suggests substantial financial backing. Siege equipment, catapults, ballistas, and what appears to be preparation for tunnel operations designed to undermine foundations rather than breach walls directly. Bastian pointed toward engineering work that was proceeding under heavy guard. They're planning extended operations rather than quick assault. The strategy was both intelligent and ominous, since prolonged siege would drain their supplies while providing time for additional enemy forces to arrive from territories whose rulers viewed the crisis as an opportunity to reshape regional power structures. Yet direct assault against Chateau Frostveil's defenses would prove costly enough to discourage immediate attempts at resolution through brute force. How long can we hold with current supplies? 3 months if rationing is implemented immediately. Perhaps 4 if we receive no additional refugees seeking sanctuary. Bastian's expression suggested that 4 months might prove optimistic if siege conditions prevented normal hunting or foraging activities. A white banner appeared among enemy positions, followed by a small delegation approaching under terms of parley that suggested negotiation rather than immediate violence. Lysander recognized the lead figure with grim satisfaction. Alpha Renaud Valdris himself had come to demand surrender of people he considered stolen property. "Shall we receive them in the Great Hall, my lord?" Captain Gaston asked with obvious distaste for entertaining enemies who had violated territorial boundaries while threatening innocent people. "The courtyard will suffice," Lysander replied curtly. "I have no intention of offering hospitality to those who come bearing ultimatums disguised as diplomatic courtesy." Alpha Valdris proved to be exactly what the mate Bond had suggested, a man whose handsome features couldn't disguise the cruelty that emanated from him like a poisonous miasma. He moved with the predatory confidence of someone accustomed to taking whatever he desired without consideration for consequences to those who suffered from his appetites. "Alpha Lysander," Valdris began with mockery of respectful address, "you have something that belongs to me, and I've come to reclaim my stolen property. I have guests who claimed sanctuary under laws that govern civilized behavior toward those seeking protection from persecution," Lysander replied with precision that made clear his opinion of anyone who viewed people as property to be owned. "The woman is my legal wife, bound by contracts that supersede any claims about sanctuary or protection. The child is my heir, whose inheritance includes obligations that cannot be dissolved through sentimental interference." Valdris smiled with an expression that suggested anticipation of violence to come. "Return them immediately, and deaths will be limited to necessary examples rather than comprehensive punishment. Lady Marguerite is my mate and queen of this territory. Young Henri is my adopted heir, protected by every law that governs royal prerogatives. Both are under my protection, which makes your demands irrelevant to any reasonable discussion. Then you choose war over wisdom, destruction over diplomacy, personal gratification over responsibility to subjects who will suffer for your emotional weakness." Valdris gestured toward the forces surrounding the castle. "Look upon what your pride has brought to these lands and consider whether your conscience can bear responsibility for deaths that could be prevented through simple surrender of 2 people whose lives matter less than thousands who face starvation and slaughter." The argument was carefully crafted to exploit exactly the concerns that responsible leadership demanded, weighing individual welfare against collective good, personal desires against duty to those who depended upon wise decisions. Yet the mate bond provided certainty that surrendering Marguerite would constitute betrayal of everything he claimed to represent about protecting innocent people. "My conscience," Lysander said quietly, "bears responsibility for ensuring that power serves justice rather than enabling systematic abuse of those who cannot defend themselves. Some principles are worth defending regardless of cost." then you will watch your people die for the sake of a woman whose word cannot be trusted, and a bastard whose existence threatens legitimate authority throughout these territories. I will watch my enemies learn that threatening innocent people carries consequences they may not survive. As the parley concluded with obvious failure to reach accommodation that either side could accept, Lysander realized that the real war was about to begin. Not merely military conflict over territory or resources, but fundamental struggle over whether love and justice could triumph over systematic cruelty disguised as political necessity. The ultimatum had been delivered and rejected. Now they would discover whether courage and determination could overcome overwhelming odds when everything worth protecting hung in the balance. Chapter 16. The Breach. The attack came during the pre-dawn hours when defenders were most likely to be tired from long watches, launched with coordination that spoke of extensive planning and professional execution. Lysander woke to sounds of battle that made his blood freeze with realization that enemies had somehow breached defenses he'd believed impregnable. The Eastern Wall! Captain Gaston's voice echoed through corridors as alarm bells rang with urgent cadence that brought every warrior to defensive positions. They've undermined the foundations. The wall is collapsing. Ice flooded Lysander's veins as he realized that weeks of apparent siege preparation had been elaborate deception concealing tunnel operations that had proceeded with deadly efficiency, while defenders focused on obvious threats. The enemy's true strategy was now revealed. Penetrate castle defenses through engineering rather than direct assault. He moved through corridors with deadly purpose while donning armor that hadn't been worn in combat for several years, ancient blade singing as it cleared its sheath in response to threats that demanded immediate and violent resolution. Behind him, loyal guards followed with grim determination to protect their Alpha's family against forces that had finally revealed their true intentions. The Eastern Wing had become a battlefield where castle defenders faced overwhelming numbers of professional warriors whose advance through breach points proceeded with systematic efficiency. Lysander joined the defense with controlled violence that reminded everyone present why he was feared throughout the northern territories. "Where are the Queen and Prince?" he demanded between exchanges with enemy soldiers whose skill suggested extensive training in rapid elimination of specific targets. "Secure in the tower chambers," Brother Antoine replied breathlessly, having apparently abandoned his usual pacifist principles to wield a staff with surprising effectiveness against attackers who threatened his patience. "But enemy forces are advancing toward that position despite our best efforts to contain them." The revelation that Marguerite and Henri were in immediate danger triggered protective instincts that transformed disciplined combat into something far more primitive and deadly. Lysander carved through enemy ranks with efficiency that owed nothing to technique, and everything to primal need to protect his mate and child from forces that sought their destruction. "My lord!" Captain Gaston's warning came barely in time as Lysander ducked beneath a blade that would have removed his head if reflexes had been slower. The attacker was revealed as one of his own former vassals, whose loyalty had apparently been purchased through promises of advancement under new leadership. "Lord Henry," Lysander snarled as he recognized the man who had questioned his judgment during recent council sessions. "I should have expected treachery from someone whose courage never matched his ambition." "You chose this path," Henry replied with the expression of someone convinced that betrayal served higher purposes than loyalty. "Your emotional weakness endangered everyone who serves this territory. Someone had to make difficult decisions you proved incapable of making." Steel rang against steel as former allies fought with hatred that transcended simple military conflict, their personal struggle representing a larger battle between competing visions of leadership and moral responsibility. Yet Lysander's enhanced strength and years of experience eventually told, leaving his former vassal cooling on stones that had witnessed his oath of fealty only months before. "The tower!" Brother Antoine's desperate cry cut through sounds of battle as a new threat became apparent. "They've reached the tower!" Terror unlike anything he'd experienced since childhood flooded through Lysander's consciousness as he realized that while he'd been fighting in the courtyard, Enemy forces had penetrated to the very heart of his defenses where Marguerite and Henri waited with only minimal guard protection. He ran through corridors that suddenly seemed endless, every step measured against time running out for people whose welfare had become more important than his own life. Behind him, loyal guards followed with desperate determination to reach their queen before enemies could complete their murderous objectives. The tower stair had become a charnel house where defenders had sold their lives dearly to protect those they'd sworn to serve. Yet their sacrifice had only delayed rather than prevented the inevitable, as sounds from above indicated that final confrontations were already taking place. Lysander took the steps 3 at a time, driven by fear that made breathing difficult and thought nearly impossible. Everything he cared about waited above, threatened by forces that would show no mercy to innocents whose only crime had been trusting his protection. The mate bond pulsed with terror and determination as he raced toward battle that would determine whether love could triumph over systematic evil, or whether choosing heart over politics had doomed everyone he'd tried to save. Time was running out, and failure would cost far more than mere political defeat. It would destroy everything that made life worth living. Chapter 17. The Trap. The tower chamber that should have contained Marguerite and Henri stood empty except for signs of struggle that made Lysander's blood turn to ice in his veins. Overturned furniture, scattered belongings, and traces of blood on stone floors told a story of desperate resistance that had ultimately proved insufficient against overwhelming force. "They're gone," Brother Antoine confirmed unnecessarily, his voice carrying devastation that matched Lysander's own emotional state. "The window glass is broken outward, suggesting they were taken rather than eliminated here." Elimination. The euphemism couldn't disguise what capture by Alpha Valdris would ultimately mean for both his mate and adopted son. Yet the fact that they'd been taken alive suggested an opportunity for rescue, if he could discover their location before enemies had time to disappear beyond his reach. "My lord," Captain Gaston called from the window, pointing toward enemy positions where white banner had been raised in a signal that demanded attention. "They request parley regarding exchange of prisoners." Prisoners. Lysander forced himself to think tactically despite emotional turmoil that made rational thought nearly impossible, understanding that enemies who possessed valuable hostages would seek to maximize their advantage through careful negotiation rather than immediate elimination. The parley took place in the same courtyard where the previous ultimatum had been delivered, though circumstances had shifted dramatically in favor of those who now held innocent lives as guarantee of compliance. Alpha Valdris approached with expression of someone who had achieved decisive victory through superior planning and ruthless execution. "Alpha Lysander," he began with a mockery of courtesy that couldn't disguise underlying satisfaction. "I believe we have matters to discuss regarding the welfare of certain individuals whose safety depends upon your willingness to accept reasonable terms. State your demands. Complete surrender of castle and territory, formal acknowledgement that your marriage was invalid under duress, and public execution to serve as example regarding consequences of interfering with legitimate territorial claims." Valdris smiled with anticipation of watching his enemy's spirit break under pressure of impossible choices. "In exchange, I offer quick deaths rather than extended entertainment. And if I refuse, then you will watch your precious mate and her bastard die slowly while learning exactly why wise leaders avoid emotional attachments that create such convenient vulnerabilities." The threat was delivered with casual cruelty that revealed Alpha Valdris as someone who genuinely enjoyed inflicting suffering upon those who couldn't defend themselves. Yet Lysander noted subtle details that suggested the situation might not be as hopeless as it appeared. "Proof of life," he demanded. "I require evidence that they remain unharmed before considering any negotiation." Valdris gestured toward his men, and moments later, Marguerite was brought forward under heavy guard, her violet eyes meeting Lysander's with a mixture of love and desperate determination. She appeared physically unharmed, though obviously terrified, while Henri was nowhere to be seen. "Satisfied?" Valdris asked mockingly. "Though I should mention that accommodations for both prisoners depend entirely upon the speed of your compliance with reasonable demands." "The child?" Safe for now, though his continued welfare requires demonstration that his self-appointed father possesses wisdom to prioritize innocent lives over stubborn pride. Lysander felt his world narrow to single focus as he processed options that all seemed to lead toward catastrophic loss, regardless of which choice he made. Surrender meant certain death for everyone he cared about, while resistance risked Marguerite and Henri's immediate execution in retaliation. I require time to consider terms that affect not only my own fate, but thousands of subjects who depend upon careful decision-making. Time is exactly what you lack, Valdris replied with obvious pleasure at watching his enemy's anguish. You have until sunset to choose between personal gratification and responsibility to those who will suffer for your emotional weakness. As the enemy delegation departed with their valuable hostages, Lysander realized that traditional military solutions would prove inadequate against opponents who were willing to use innocent lives as shields while conducting negotiation through systematized torture. Yet the mate bond continued pulsing with something that felt almost like determination, despite desperate circumstances, suggesting that Marguerite had plans of her own that might provide opportunities for those clever enough to recognize and exploit them. The trap had been sprung with devastating effectiveness, but perhaps the hunters had underestimated the resourcefulness of prey, who possessed more strength and intelligence than anyone had suspected. Time was running out, but the final act of this deadly drama had yet to be written. Chapter 18. The Choice. The war council that convened in the Great Hall carried an atmosphere of funeral preparation as Lysander's remaining advisors contemplated options that ranged from disastrous to catastrophic, with no clear path toward salvation for innocents whose lives hung in the balance. Maps spread across tables showed tactical positions that had become irrelevant once enemies possessed hostages whose welfare superseded all military considerations. Our situation is essentially hopeless, Chancellor Olivier stated with brutal honesty that made everyone wince. Valdris holds every advantage while offering terms that guarantee our destruction regardless of compliance or resistance. Furthermore, added Lord Treasurer Armand, prolonging negotiations will likely result in enhanced suffering for the prisoners while providing no meaningful chance of improving our position. Each assessment struck like hammer blows against hope that was already stretched beyond rational limits. Yet Lysander found himself unable to accept defeat when acceptance would doom everyone he cared about to deaths that would serve no purpose beyond enemy gratification. Lord Commander, he said evenly, what intelligence do we possess regarding prisoner location and guard strength? They're being held in the enemy's main encampment, approximately 2 miles south of our position, Bastian replied with professional calm that concealed obvious concern about orders he suspected were coming. Guard strength appears substantial, though precise numbers are difficult to determine from available reconnaissance. Assault possibilities? Essentially suicidal, my lord. Any rescue attempt would require crossing open ground under enemy observation, penetrating fortified positions held by overwhelming numbers, and extracting prisoners before reinforcements could prevent escape. Bastian paused meaningfully. Success would require either divine intervention or tactical advantages we currently lack. Divine intervention. Lysander almost smiled at the irony, since recent events had certainly tested his faith in powers greater than human calculation and military strength. Yet something about the mate bond suggested that unusual resources might be available to those desperate enough to attempt impossible rescues. My lord, Chancellor Olivier said carefully, perhaps the time has come to consider whether individual lives, however precious, should be preserved at the cost of thousands who will suffer if this conflict escalates beyond current boundaries. You suggest surrender? I suggest acceptance that some situations cannot be improved through good intentions or heroic gestures, regardless of personal attachments that make rational decisions emotionally difficult. The argument was logical, compelling, and utterly reprehensible to someone whose mate bond provided constant awareness of Marguerite's terror and desperate hope that rescue might somehow prove possible, despite overwhelming odds against success. Gentlemen, Lysander said finally, his voice carrying authority that ended debate before it could develop further. Prepare for immediate evacuation of all non-essential personnel to Allied territories that might provide temporary sanctuary. And essential personnel? Bastian asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer. Will remain to attempt rescue of our queen and prince, regardless of personal cost or likelihood of success. My lord, Chancellor Olivier protested, such action guarantees destruction of everything we've built while serving no constructive purpose beyond symbolic gesture that satisfies conscience but achieves nothing practical. Sometimes, Lysander replied with certainty that transcended rational calculation, symbolic gestures are exactly what circumstances require to distinguish between civilization and barbarity. As his advisors departed with obvious reluctance to implement orders they viewed as suicidal madness, Lysander contemplated the transformation that had occurred within him since finding Marguerite buried in snow. The cold pragmatism that had governed his reign was giving way to something warmer and more dangerous, willingness to risk everything for principles that mattered more than mere survival. The mate bond pulsed with grim determination as he prepared for battle that would either restore his family or destroy everyone who attempted impossible rescue against overwhelming odds. Some wars were fought for territory, others for resources, still others for political advantage. But the conflict that was approaching would be waged for love, justice, and the fundamental question of whether good people would fight for innocent lives, even when victory seemed impossible. The choice had been made, and now they would discover whether courage and determination could overcome enemies who had forgotten that some things were worth dying for. Chapter 19. The Dark Night. Alone in his chambers as midnight approached with finality of approaching execution, Lysander confronted the devastating possibility that choosing love over political wisdom had doomed not only himself, but everyone who had trusted his leadership. Through windows that had once revealed peaceful countryside, enemy campfires now dotted the landscape like fallen stars marking positions of forces that held his mate and child hostage. The mate bond had grown weaker throughout the evening, either from distance or from whatever torments Valdris was inflicting upon Marguerite to ensure compliance with his demands. Each diminished pulse felt like a piece of his soul being torn away, leaving emptiness that made breathing difficult and thought nearly impossible. Reports from scouts painted increasingly dire pictures of enemy preparations for final assault that would begin at dawn, regardless of whether terms were accepted. Siege equipment had been moved into position, assault ladders prepared, and additional forces had arrived to ensure overwhelming superiority during climactic battle that would determine control of territory and fate of everyone within castle walls. My lord? Brother Antoine's soft voice interrupted contemplation of failures that had brought them to this desperate point. Perhaps confession might provide some comfort during these dark hours. What comfort exists for someone whose pride and emotional weakness have destroyed innocent lives? Lysander replied bitterly, understanding that religious absolution could not restore life to those who would die because he'd chosen heart over wisdom. The comfort of knowing that some choices, regardless of their consequences, honor principles that define what it means to be truly human, rather than merely successful. The elderly monk settled into a chair beside the cold hearth where fire had died to embers that provided little warmth against chill that seemed to emanate from within rather than without. His weathered face bore the expression of someone who had witnessed enough suffering to understand both its necessity and its ultimate meaning. I destroyed everything, Lysander said quietly, voicing despair that had been building since the moment he'd found empty chambers where his family should have been safe. My people, my territory, my mate, my child, all sacrificed upon the altar of romantic delusions about love conquering evil. Or perhaps, Brother Antoine suggested gently, you discovered that some things are worth preserving even when preservation seems impossible, that love provides strength rather than weakness when faced with forces that would reduce everything to mere calculation of power and control. What strength? What victory? They will die horribly while I watch helplessly, having accomplished nothing except proving that emotional decisions lead to catastrophic consequences. They will die knowing that someone loved them enough to risk everything for their welfare, that their lives mattered more than political convenience or personal safety. The monk's voice carried certainty that transcended mere religious faith. Sometimes that knowledge is worth any sacrifice required to provide it. Through the window, sounds of enemy celebration echoed across terrain that had once been peaceful agricultural land, supporting families who now faced starvation or death depending upon outcomes of conflicts they had never chosen. Their suffering served as a reminder of leadership responsibilities that extended far beyond personal attachments. How can love justify such destruction? How can anything else justify existence that reduces human beings to mere resources to be managed rather than souls to be cherished? Brother Antoine countered with a question that cut to heart of fundamental philosophical differences. You chose to protect innocence against those who would destroy them for political advantage. That choice honors everything worth preserving about civilization, even if it destroys civilization in the process. Civilization that cannot protect its most vulnerable members from systematic abuse has already destroyed itself through moral bankruptcy, the monk replied firmly. Better honest destruction than corrupt preservation of systems that enable cruelty while pretending to serve justice. As midnight bells chimed with sound that might have been funeral dirges for everything he'd tried to build, Lysander felt something shift within his consciousness. Not acceptance of defeat, but recognition that some battles were worth fighting regardless of odds against victory. The mate bond pulsed with sudden intensity that suggested Marguerite was thinking of him during her own dark vigil, sharing determination across distance that separated them physically while connecting them spiritually through forces that transcended political calculation or military strategy. Perhaps love didn't guarantee victory, but it provided reason to continue fighting when surrender would constitute betrayal of everything that made struggle worthwhile. Dawn was approaching, and with it, the final test of whether courage and determination could overcome systematic evil despite overwhelming disadvantages. The long, dark night was ending, but the battle for souls and principles was about to begin. Chapter 20. The revelation dawn brought salvation from an unexpected source as Captain Gaston arrived with intelligence that transformed desperate circumstances into unprecedented opportunity. His expression carried excitement barely contained beneath professional composure as he presented documents that would reshape understanding of their tactical situation. "My lord, urgent communication from allies we didn't know existed," he announced, spreading correspondence across the table with careful precision. "Lady Marguerite has been far more active during her captivity than our enemies realized." Lysander felt hope ignite in his chest like a spark in dry tinder as he examined letters written in Marguerite's distinctive hand, each one carrying coded information about enemy positions, guard rotations, and vulnerabilities that could be exploited by rescue forces possessing sufficient knowledge and determination. How did these reach us? Through a network of loyal retainers from her father's territory who have been working secretly to undermine Valdres's authority for years. Captain Gaston explained with obvious admiration for the complexity of hidden resistance. Brother Francois apparently represents far more than simple ecclesiastical neutrality. The revelation that religious orders had been coordinating opposition to systematic corruption provided context for events that had seemed impossibly fortuitous. Marguerite's rescue from the snow, Brother Francois's timely arrival with evidence, even the precision of intelligence now being provided, all represented parts of a larger strategy designed to expose and defeat forces that threatened innocent lives throughout the region. What specific assistance do they offer? Diversionary assault against enemy supply lines beginning at dawn, coordinated with internal uprising by prisoners and sympathizers within Valdres ranks. Captain Gaston's finger traced routes on maps that showed multiple simultaneous operations. Additionally, detailed information about prisoner location and guard strength that makes rescue attempt feasible rather than suicidal. Each piece of information struck like a physical blow against despair that had dominated his thoughts throughout the endless night. The mate bond pulsed with renewed strength as he realized that Marguerite had been fighting her own battle, while he'd wrestled with self-recrimination and philosophical doubts about wisdom of choosing love over political convenience. Numbers: approximately 1,500 fighters from territories that have suffered under Valdris expansion, plus unknown quantities of sympathizers within enemy ranks who await signals to reveal their true loyalties. Captain Gaston smiled with anticipation of battle that had shifted from hopeless last stand to coordinated offensive operation. We are no longer alone in this fight. Lord Commander Bastion appeared in the doorway with additional intelligence that completed the transformation of the tactical situation from impossible to merely dangerous. My lord, enemy forces are showing signs of internal division as word spreads about the nature of conflict they've been drawn into, he reported with satisfaction. Many mercenaries were hired to support territorial disputes, not systematic murder of innocents. Knowledge that they're fighting to enable torture and abuse has created morale problems that their commanders are struggling to address. Furthermore, added Brother Antoine with an expression that suggested divine intervention might not be metaphorical after all, several Alliance representatives have requested a private meeting to discuss evidence of corruption that calls into question the legitimacy of their initial demands. The Continental Alliance. Lysander realized that Marguerite's hidden allies had been working multiple levels of political pressure, while he'd focused on immediate military concerns. If Alliance authority could be turned against forces they'd originally supported, the entire balance of power would shift in ways that made victory possible rather than merely symbolic. What evidence do they possess? Complete documentation of Alpha Christoph's assassination, financial records proving conspiracy between multiple territorial leaders, witness testimony regarding systematic abuse and murder of innocents. Brother Antoine's voice carried the satisfaction of someone whose patience had finally been rewarded. Everything necessary to expose corruption reaching to the highest levels of regional government. As preparations began for a coordinated offensive that would either restore his family or destroy everyone who attempted an impossible rescue, Lysander felt certainty that transcended tactical calculation or military strategy. The mate bond sang with righteous purpose as he realized that love and justice had found allies among those who understood that some principles were worth defending, regardless of personal cost or political convenience. The revelation had transformed their situation from hopeless last stand into battle for civilization itself, with victory meaning not only personal salvation but triumph of compassion over cruelty throughout the known world. Dawn was breaking, and with it came the possibility of a future built on foundations stronger than fear and more durable than mere political arrangement. The real war was about to begin, but this time they would fight with allies who shared their commitment to protecting innocents against forces that viewed human suffering as an acceptable cost of maintaining power. Victory was no longer impossible. It was inevitable for those who possessed courage to fight for what truly mattered. Chapter 21. The Alliance. The War Council that convened in the Great Hall bore no resemblance to previous desperate gatherings, as representatives from multiple territories filled chairs that had recently seemed destined to remain forever empty. Maps spread across tables now showed coordinated operations spanning hundreds of miles, with arrows indicating movement of Allied forces that had been gathering secretly for months while awaiting opportunity to strike against a common enemy. Brother Francois has done remarkable work, acknowledged Lord Cameron de Roussillon, whose arrival with 500 mounted knights had transformed tactical possibilities from merely hopeful to genuinely promising. The evidence against Alpha Valdris extends far beyond individual crimes to encompass systematic conspiracy that threatens legitimate authority throughout the region. Lysander studied faces that had been enemies or strangers only days before, now united by shared recognition that protecting innocent lives mattered more than traditional territorial boundaries or political conveniences. The transformation was so dramatic that he wondered if divine intervention might be literal rather than metaphorical. What response has the Continental Alliance provided to this evidence? He asked, noting how representatives exchanged glances that suggested significant developments had occurred during overnight negotiations. Formal suspension of Alpha Valdris's territorial authority, pending investigation of charges that include murder, conspiracy, and systematic violation of laws governing treatment of non-combatants, replied Lady Isabel de Montclair, whose own territory had suffered under Valdris expansion until her husband's convenient death. Additionally, authorization for joint military action to restore legitimate governance and protect endangered populations. Authorization for joint military action. The phrase carried weight that transformed their situation from desperate rebellion against overwhelming odds into a sanctioned operation designed to restore justice and protect innocent lives. Yet Lysander understood that such authorization came with conditions that might prove as restricting as they were empowering. And the prisoners? Remain in immediate danger until rescue operations can be completed, Lord Commander Bastian replied grimly. Intelligence suggests that Valdris has received word about alliance development and may attempt to eliminate evidence by executing hostages before coordinated assault begins. The information struck him like a physical blow, since delay might doom Marguerite and Henri, while haste could jeopardize broader operations that offered hope for permanent solution to corruption that had poisoned regional politics for years. Personal and political considerations demanded different responses, creating tension that tested everything he'd learned about leadership priorities. Time frame for coordinated assault? Diversionary attacks begin within the hour. Lord Cameron reported with satisfaction of someone anticipating a long-awaited opportunity for justice. Main offensive launches at dawn, with prisoner rescue operations commencing immediately thereafter. However, added Lady Isabel with obvious concern, success depends upon precision timing that allows minimal opportunity for enemy response against hostages they hold. Any deviation from planned coordination could prove catastrophic for everyone we're trying to protect. The warning was diplomatically phrased, but carried clear implication that individual heroics or emotional decisions could jeopardize carefully planned operations designed to serve interests larger than personal attachments. Yet the mate bond pulsed with desperate urgency that made waiting feel like betrayal of people whose suffering continued, while political niceties were observed. "My lord," Brother Antoine said quietly, producing final communication from Marguerite that had arrived through channels so secret that even Allied commanders hadn't known of their existence. Perhaps this will provide guidance for decisions that must balance personal and political considerations. The letter was brief, but carried weight that transcended mere words. My beloved, trust in allies who fight for justice rather than personal gain. Henri and I will endure whatever trials await, secure in knowledge that our suffering serves a purpose greater than individual welfare. When victory comes, and it will come, let it represent the triumph of love and justice over systematic cruelty that has poisoned too many lives for too long. As he read words that revealed Marguerite's strength despite circumstances that would have broken lesser spirits, Lysander realized that true love sometimes demanded sacrifice of immediate desires to serve principles that mattered more than personal happiness. The alliance had provided means for victory, but such victory required patience and trust that went against every instinct demanding immediate action to protect his mate and child. Dawn was approaching, and with it the culmination of a struggle that had begun with a compassionate choice to rescue strangers from a snowstorm. Whether that choice would prove wisdom or folly depended upon the courage and determination of people who had learned that some things were worth fighting for regardless of personal cost. The real battle was about to begin, but this time they would fight with allies who shared their commitment to creating a world where love and justice could triumph over systematic cruelty. Victory was within reach for those brave enough to seize it. Chapter 22. The March. The pre-dawn darkness buzzed with controlled activity as Allied forces prepared for coordinated assault that would either restore justice to territories that had suffered under systematic oppression or witness destruction of everyone brave enough to challenge established corruption. Lysander moved through preparations with calm efficiency that concealed emotional turmoil, threatening to overwhelm rational thought as 0 hour approached. First diversionary attack succeeds completely. Captain Gaston reported with satisfaction that reflected successful execution of complex timing. Enemy supply lines are in chaos, with reinforcements being diverted from main encampment to address multiple crisis points throughout their extended positions. Prisoner status. Intelligence confirms that both Lady Marguerite and young Henri remain alive, though transfer to a more secure location appears imminent as enemy commanders recognize a developing threat to their position. Transfer. Lysander felt ice form in his stomach as he realized that success of diversionary operations might prompt exactly the response they'd hoped to prevent: elimination of hostages before rescue could be completed. The irony was devastating. Every tactical victory brought them closer to losing the people they'd fought to protect. Distance to main encampment? 2 miles across terrain that provides minimal cover for approaching forces. Lord Commander Bastian replied grimly. Enemy positions remain strong despite internal disruption, with adequate warning time to execute hostages before assault forces can penetrate the defensive perimeter. The tactical situation demanded an impossible choice between speed that might trigger hostage execution and caution that allowed time for enemy response to developing crises. Traditional military wisdom suggested patience and coordination, while every instinct screamed for immediate action that might save lives through desperate intervention. "My lord," Lord Cameron said carefully, "perhaps the time has come to trust Allied forces and coordinated planning rather than individual initiative that could jeopardize carefully balanced operation." Trust. The word carried weight that touched the core of transformation Lysander had undergone since finding Marguerite in the snow. The isolated leader who had trusted no one beyond immediate advisors was being asked to place faith in strangers whose loyalty was proven only through shared commitment to abstract principles of justice. Yet the mate bond pulsed with something that felt like certainty, despite desperate circumstances. Marguerite's unwavering faith that love and justice would ultimately triumph over systematic cruelty, regardless of immediate trials that tested courage and determination. "Signal for coordinated advance," he commanded, understanding that some decisions required a leap of faith beyond rational calculation. "We move as planned, with trust that principles worth fighting for are worth the risks required to defend them." The march that followed was unlike anything in Lysander's military experience, as forces from multiple territories advanced with coordination that spoke of shared purpose transcending traditional political boundaries. Knights rode beside common soldiers, territorial enemies fought as allies, and personal grievances were set aside in service of universal principles that mattered more than individual advantage. Through darkness that would soon give way to dawn, they moved across a landscape scarred by years of conflict and oppression, carrying hope for a future built on foundations stronger than fear and more durable than mere political convenience. The mate bond provided constant awareness of Marguerite's determination, despite circumstances that would have broken lesser spirits. "Approach coordinates achieved," whispered the scout whose return marked transition from movement to assault. "Enemy positions confirm intelligence reports, though activity suggests awareness that attack is imminent." Awareness meant preparation, which meant that advantages of surprise had been sacrificed to necessities of coordination. Yet, as Lysander studied faces of allies who had chosen justice over safety, he felt certainty that courage and determination could overcome tactical disadvantages when motivated by principles worth any sacrifice. "All forces in position?" he asked quietly, noting how commanders from different territories had learned to work together despite lifetimes of mutual suspicion. "Ready for your signal, my lord," Lord Commander Bastian confirmed with an expression that suggested absolute confidence in success despite overwhelming odds against survival. Dawn was breaking over the battlefield that would determine whether love and justice could triumph over systematic cruelty, or whether choosing compassion over convenience had doomed everyone brave enough to believe that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of personal cost. The march was ending, but the real battle was about to begin. Victory was no longer impossible. It was inevitable for those who possessed courage to reach for it. The signal was given, and with it came the culmination of a struggle that had begun with choice to protect strangers in a snowstorm. Chapter 23. The climax. The assault began with devastating precision as Allied forces struck enemy positions from multiple directions simultaneously, transforming Alpha Valdris's seemingly impregnable encampment into chaos that revealed how thoroughly their coordination had caught defenders off guard. Lysander fought at the center of the main advance, ancient blade singing as it carved through enemies with efficiency that owed everything to desperate need to reach his mate and child before opportunities for rescue could disappear. "The command tent!" Lord Cameron shouted over din of battle, pointing toward an elaborate pavilion where enemy banners still flew, despite the collapse of the defensive perimeter around it. "Intelligence suggests prisoner location adjacent to command position." Adjacent meant close enough for immediate execution if rescue attempt failed, but also accessible to forces that could penetrate the final defensive ring around Alpha Valdris's personal guards. The tactical situation demanded overwhelming force applied with surgical precision, enough violence to eliminate resistance without providing time for the final act of spite against helpless hostages. Lysander led the final charge with controlled fury that made his wolf's presence apparent in enhanced strength and deadly grace of movements that seemed to transcend normal human limitations. Behind him, knights and soldiers followed with determination that spoke of shared commitment to principles worth dying for when necessary. The command tent had been transformed into a fortress where Alpha Valdris made final stand with personal guard, whose loyalty was purchased through promises of advancement rather than inspired by genuine respect for leadership. Their resistance was professional, but brittle, lacking the desperate intensity of defenders who fought for causes they believed in rather than mere employment contracts. "Surrender!" Lysander commanded as steel met steel in combat that carried the weight of all previous conflicts between systematic cruelty and protective justice. "Your position is hopeless, your allies have abandoned you, and continued resistance serves no purpose beyond prolonging inevitable defeat." "Inevitable?" Valdris snarled as he pressed attack with technique that spoke of extensive training perverted to serve personal appetites, rather than noble purposes. "Watch how inevitable your victory becomes when I demonstrate appropriate treatment of property that refuses to accept ownership." The threat was accompanied by gestures toward the tent's rear section where sounds suggested that Marguerite and Henri were being held under guard, whose instructions apparently included immediate execution if rescue appeared imminent. Time was running out for negotiation or careful tactical planning. What followed was not combat in any civilized sense, but systematic destruction of someone who had confused power with authority, while forgetting that true strength came from protecting others rather than exploiting their vulnerabilities. Lysander's blade found its target with precision that ended threats to innocent lives while proving that justice, however delayed, possessed a sharp edge when wielded by those who understood its true purpose. "Where are they?" he demanded of surviving guards whose loyalty evaporated when their employer could no longer provide protection or payment for services that had involved systematic torture of defenseless people. "The rear chamber," one replied quickly, apparently hoping that cooperation might earn mercy from victors who had proven capable of showing appropriate restraint when resistance ceased. "Both alive, though the woman was injured during transport from the previous location." Injured. The word made his wolf snarl with protective fury at the idea that anyone had dared to harm his mate while she remained helpless to defend herself. Yet as he pushed through tent flaps that separated him from reunion he'd begun to believe impossible, the sight that greeted him proved that some wounds could heal, while others created strength that transcended mere physical damage. Marguerite sat in a corner of makeshift prison, holding Henri with fierce protectiveness that had somehow survived everything their enemies had inflicted during captivity, designed to break spirits too strong for conventional defeat. Her violet eyes met his with love and relief that made breathing difficult, while proving that mate bonds could endure separation, torture, and circumstances that would have destroyed connections built on less substantial foundations. "My beloved," she whispered, as he gathered both of them into an embrace that felt like restoration of missing pieces of his soul. "I knew you would come. I never doubted that love and justice would find a way to triumph over systematic cruelty." Her faith had been justified, but the victory carried costs that would require careful accounting as they began the process of rebuilding lives and territories that had been damaged by years of corruption and abuse. The climax was complete, but resolution would demand wisdom equal to courage that had brought them through trials that tested everything they claimed to believe about protecting innocent people from those who viewed human suffering as an acceptable cost of maintaining power. Chapter 24. Forever Changed. 6 months after the battle that had restored justice to territories throughout the northern kingdoms, Lysander stood upon the battlements of Chateau Frostveil, watching sunrise paint sky in shades of gold and rose that spoke of hope made manifest through courage and determination. The landscape below bore little resemblance to war-torn terrain that had witnessed struggle between love and systematic cruelty. The reconstruction proceeds ahead of schedule, Queen Marguerite reported as she joined him at their favorite vantage point, carrying herself with grace that spoke of complete recovery from injuries sustained during captivity. Villages that were destroyed during territorial expansions are being rebuilt according to plans that prioritize community welfare over defensive considerations. Her transformation from broken refugee to confident queen continued inspiring everyone who witnessed resilience that had survived systematic attempts to destroy spirits too strong for conventional defeat. Yet Lysander understood that healing from such comprehensive trauma would continue for years, requiring patience and support that he was committed to providing regardless of duration. And the Alliance investigation? Complete exoneration of all charges against our territory, combined with formal commendation for exposing corruption that had infected regional governance at multiple levels. Her smile carried satisfaction that transcended personal vindication to encompass broader victory for principles they'd risked everything to defend. More importantly, new protocols for investigating abuse complaints ensure that future victims will have recourse beyond suffering in silence. The Continental Alliance had ultimately proven capable of choosing justice over political convenience when evidence became too overwhelming to ignore, through comfortable rationalization. Yet transformation of institutions that had enabled systematic abuse would require ongoing vigilance against forces that preferred darkness to light. Henri adapts well to his new circumstances? Lysander asked, watching their son play in gardens that had been expanded to include sections designed specifically for children, whose laughter now filled spaces that had once echoed only with sounds of political maneuvering. Remarkably well, considering everything he experienced during his earliest months. Having Celeste as an older sister provides stability, while demonstrating that love creates families stronger than blood alone could achieve. Through windows below, Celeste's voice could be heard explaining some important matter to Henri, with patience, that suggested natural talent for nurturing, that would serve her well when she inherited responsibility for territories built on principles of protection rather than exploitation. The formal adoption proceedings conclude next week, Marguerite continued, with a voice that carried emotions too deep for simple words. After which he will legally be Prince Henri de Frostveil, heir to territories that will be governed according to principles we've learned through experience rather than inherited through tradition. Prince Henri de Frostveil. The title carried weight that transcended mere political convenience to represent hope for future generations, who would inherit a world where systematic abuse was recognized as crime rather than acceptable discipline, where protecting vulnerable people was understood as strength rather than weakness. "And our own future?" he asked quietly, noting how her hand moved instinctively to rest upon abdomen, where new life was beginning to grow despite everything they'd endured together. "Our daughter will be born into a world that has been changed by choices we made to protect innocent people, rather than accept convenient lies about the necessity of systematic cruelty." Her voice carried certainty that made Matebond sing with harmonious purpose. "She will grow up knowing that love multiplies strength rather than creating weakness." Daughter. The revelation that their child would be female added layers of meaning to the legacy they were building through daily choices that prioritized compassion over convenience. Princess de Frostveil would inherit territories where women were protected rather than exploited, where children were cherished rather than viewed as property. "Do you ever regret the path that brought us together?" he asked, understanding that some journeys extracted prices that might seem too steep when viewed from the perspective of comfortable safety. "Never," she replied with absolute conviction that made his heart sing with gratitude for fate that had delivered a perfect partner, despite circumstances that had seemed designed to prevent such happiness. Everything we endured, the suffering, the terror, the near impossible choices, led to this moment when love and justice triumphed over forces that sought to reduce human beings to mere objects for exploitation. As afternoon approached with news of continued prosperity throughout their expanded territories, where former enemies now worked as allies to build society based on principles learned through bitter experience, Lysander reflected on the transformation that had occurred within him since discovering 2 lives buried in snow. The isolated leader who had ruled through fear and intimidation was gone, replaced by a protector who understood that true authority came from serving others rather than dominating them. Love had not weakened his capacity for leadership, but enhanced it by providing motivation that transcended mere political calculation. "What are you thinking about?" Marguerite asked, noting contemplative expressions that had become familiar during quiet moments stolen from responsibilities of governance. "Those scars tell stories worth remembering," he replied, echoing words she had spoken during her own recovery. "Mine say I learned to see beyond surface appearances to recognize worth that others overlooked, that I chose love over convenience despite costs that seemed unbearable, that I discovered strength in vulnerability when shared with someone who understood its true value. And mine? Tell a story of courage that survived systematic attempts at destruction, of love that protected innocent life despite impossible odds, of determination that transformed personal trauma into universal principles protecting countless others who would never know how one woman's suffering catalyzed changes that improved their lives. Together they had discovered that individual choices to protect innocent people could reshape civilization itself when motivated by principles that mattered more than personal comfort or political advantage. Their love story had become testament to the power of compassion over cruelty, hope over despair, justice over expedient compromise. The circle was complete, but their work would continue as long as vulnerable people needed protection from those who viewed human suffering as an acceptable cost of maintaining power that served only itself. Their legacy lived not in monuments or official records, but in daily choices made by ordinary people who had learned that extraordinary courage was simply the decision to protect others when protection was needed most, regardless of personal cost or probability of success. Love and justice had triumphed, but victory required eternal vigilance against forces that preferred darkness to light, oppression to freedom, systematic cruelty to compassionate understanding of what it truly meant to be strong enough to serve, rather than powerful enough to destroy.